There's something about certain kinds of music that retains its appeal. Not only pop music, but classical music. I think some classical music is emblematic of its time and only its time, and other musics tend to remain relevant, for hundreds of years by necessity with great works. And I think with popular music, you mentioned the Beatles. That's a really idiosyncratic musical event. Their work together, and the fact that it drew on so many different influences and had such far-reaching effects. One has this impression that they must have just been, how can we revolutionize music today? But they were just doing what they were doing naturally, as most great composers, musicians do. They just kind of do what they have to do, what they're compelled to do. And I think the Beatles were a wonderful band. I mean, the music remains fresh, and I think it's part of being a snobby classical music listener, as I am. There are only a few bands and artists that have such depth of quality in their work, so that if you buy a Mahler symphony recording, there are no weak tracks on that record. And in similar fashion, at least the effect that I've felt from listening to Radiohead, listening to Elliott Smith, listening to Nick Drake, I've never met a song of theirs that I didn't love. So there is something to be said for great consistency of quality, and that really tells, I think. Yes. That's the thing, it's you hear a piece of music and you want to be inside it. You want to be living the piece of music, and sometimes it's not written for piano. And it is covetousness first and foremost, just because that's the way you're going to by necessity find a way to make it work on piano. If you didn't really feel like it, if you just thought, well, this might be a nice idea, or maybe I should do Radiohead for piano and string orchestra. It's not. It doesn't come from one's personal relationship with the music itself. The idea that yes, this is thrilling, and I think I can find a way to make this thrilling on the piano. It's really a sort of that's really the impetus of that covetousness. I have to play this piece. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the words. Unfortunately, fortunately for everybody, I don't sing. But unfortunately, we don't get a sense of the words just in piano version, and yet it's quite a challenge. And part of the work that I'm trying to do is that oftentimes, and it's part of the life of these artists, Elliott Smith, Nick Drake, Radiohead, that you often have this sense of irony in that you have, let's say, a very beautiful musical texture, and then the lyric is rather dark. So even if one can't hear the words, I know the words, and I'm seeking to create the irony there instead of just making a literal transcription of the pretty texture of something like Radiohead's No Surprises. I'll put in some extra notes that sort of color it and make you a little bit suspicious as to whether there really is a silver lining. And the lyrics really do inform that kind of choice. It's been similar to things that I've done throughout my classical career, in that I'm always really drawn to bringing music to people who may not be familiar with it, something that I find beautiful, that I think under the right circumstances the audience will find beautiful as well. I do think it's important to be open to new experiences, and I do think that as much great classical music as there is, there's other great music as well. And the Duke Ellington adage, there are only two kinds of music, good music and bad music, brings the responsibility to the performer, in that we are responsible for presenting what we believe in. Mm-hmm. The audience is responsible for judging what they hear by how they feel about what they hear, not by genre prejudice or knowing the names and dates and places of the composers and all the back material, but just the kind of the visceral, immediate experience of what hearing a piece of music is like. Liszt was an extraordinary advocate of composers of his time and prior, and made amazing transcriptions. Some of them, rather literal. I mean, of course, this was in a time before recording, and so, there were a lot more people going to hear Liszt play, all of it, and he was a great touring musician. So he was a fantastically generous artist in that he played a lot of people's music. And that might have been, who knows, sitting down and reading Liszt's transcription, forehand transcription of the Beethoven Symphony might have been somebody's first experience with the Beethoven Symphony, for all we know. So yeah, I would like to think of myself in his camp, but I don't have an original idea in my head. The only things that I do for piano are other people's music. I heard Nick Drake's music for the first time maybe 7 or 8 years ago in a restaurant. I was sitting there and I heard his voice, and harmony is also something that affects me very much in an immediate sense, and so I heard that, and luckily my dinner partner knew who it was, and so I went and sought out all the material available of Nick Drake. It was really, that kind of epiphany, you just hear it and you say, what's that? And then to find out that, he died as a young man, 26 years old, 30 years ago, and feeling so, terrible that, I was certainly listening to music at that time, and why didn't I know who Nick Drake was? And, Well, I didn't know his music, and most of the time when I'm doing these arrangements, these transcriptions, these reimaginings, it's not really like, oh, I'm going to, tackle this one or that one. It's really a matter of what song is capturing my imagination at that moment. As it happens, as long as I've been working on Radiohead and Elliott Smith, I've been working on Nick Drake. When I was first doing my Radiohead arrangements, I was, at that time, very inspired, having heard Nick Drake for the first time. And so, 3 of the songs that I play in this set were done several years ago. And it's only, because I don't think it's really a good way to go about it in terms of, okay, well, it's going to be this artist, and, there might be some songs that don't really work on piano. You have to wait until the song grabs you, and then all of a sudden you say, well, gee, there's 65, 75 minutes of music. I think we've got a concert here. So that's really the best way, the most, sort of the way of integrity, I think, with the music. Many times the pop music is rather monolithic in its texture, and it's in particular in the case of Radiohead, you really have a 5-piece ensemble, each member of which is contributing a line, a thread to each song. They're not doing it in an arty way. That's just kind of the way they work. They really are a great community of equals, and they really do make an integral contribution to every song that they do. With Elliott Smith, you have the textural differences between, let's say, Elliott Smith doing a song in a studio version as opposed to doing a solo version, and the disparity between the possibility of what he can do solo and the choices that he makes as a solo artist when he plays a song, as opposed to the sort of the more filled out texture. Even with his production style, there's always a sense of suggesting textural possibilities. It's not, again, just kind of set in front of you. It's very suggestive. And with Nick Drake, he was had original way of playing the guitar, of tuning the guitar, a real virtuoso style. And what's made working on Nick Drake's music so interesting for me is there were studio versions of the songs, and there were some versions that he recorded at home. Sometimes very different treatments. And of course, hearing him play pieces solo was very different than hearing studio versions with musicians who were perhaps sympathetic, but not necessarily, inside his head, and so not really able to really come up with perhaps the ideal version. So I'm able to include, within one song, I can almost make a suite of one song based on available materials, studio, home version, as I say, sometimes very, very different, and so we have different sides of the same song coexisting within one, piano work. One thing that's very interesting about Nick Drake's music, which was very, very hard to get, is that he really phrases vocally like a jazz singer. I was never presented with such difficulty really getting the rhythm of the vocal part down as much as I was challenged by Nick's music. And it's interesting to think of that in terms of him being basically a sort of a folk artist or a folk rock artist, but then there are these quite serious jazz influences, and it's almost like scat singing sometimes when you know. And so getting that on the piano and trying again, it was almost sung to himself too. So it's not terribly. There's a tension between how much of this sort of extroverted way of playing things on the piano sometimes. How much can you stretch that which he really sort of played in a very inward style? I'm more inspired by the harmonies themselves to be a little bit more extroverted with it, where perhaps he himself might have been more retiring, a little bit more modest. I think there's an exuberance and exhilaration in the music itself that I tend to exploit in the piano version. Actually, when I grew up, when I was 12 or 13, I started a rock band, and I was still playing classical. I had a rock band, and then I had a sort of a jazz rock fusion band in high school. Then when I auditioned for music schools, New England Conservatory of Music, where I went to school, was my first choice because they had a great classical program, they had a great jazz program, they had a third stream program. There were the possibilities of dealing with music, all kinds of music, in a very respectful way. Gunther Schuller was the president of the conservatory at that time, New England Conservatory in Boston, and he's a very serious musician about everything, about every kind of music. You know, playing Scott Joplin is not a busman's holiday. There are stylistic things to be listened to. There are old recordings of U.B. Blake and Shelley Rowe Morton that are important to know how to play that style. It's the same sort of information and informed performance that you would want to have, if you were playing Mozart and you wanted to read, the letters of the time, or listen to, treatises on how they played their instruments at that time. Same kind of thing. I mean, there's a lot of source material for a lot of jazz, tango, what have you. There's a history with this music, and it is incumbent upon us to really take on that history. So I never really was first and foremost a jazz musician, but I did play jazz professionally. So that now, when I'm coming back to these arrangements, it's not like I'm a tourist. It's another part of, I decided to toe the line because in school I just felt the physical vocabulary that involved jazz playing was a little bit more sort of getting into it, externally and working it through. And so there's sort of the refined touch that one needed for a Mozart concerto, for instance. All of a sudden I'm throwing my hands around, and the discipline was what I wanted to go for. It was really, I felt more challenging to reinvigorate classic works and then, leave the jazz alone. Absolutely. I love playing the Brahms First Piano Concerto as much as I love playing Nick Drake. Yeah. Just doing whatever, whenever. Yeah. Always. Yeah, jazz and now the radio show going on TV, and so yeah, it's a fun life.
Wonderful.